No, should we go let? I never know when it's a good time to start, so I think we should just get started. We're sort of trickling. All right, so hey everyone, thanks for joining us for this discussion today on racial justice in the U.S. labor movement. My name is Mara Chinelli. I'm a member of the Labor Branch of the New York City chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America. The Labor Branch serves as an organizing and strategizing space for unionized and non-unionized workers to build rank and file power in their workplaces and beyond. Joining us today, we have Michael Goldfield and Robin Kelley. Michael Goldfield is a former civil rights, anti-war, and labor activist, professor emeritus and research fellow at Wayne State University in Detroit, Michigan. He's the author of numerous articles and books on race and class, including The Decline of Organized Labor in the United States, The Myth of Capitalism Reborn, and most recently, The Southern Key, Class, Race, and Radicalism in the 1930s and 1940s. Robin Kelley is an award-winning author and Gary B. Nash Professor of American History at UCLA. His research has covered the history of social movements in the US, Marxism and Black intellectualism, the African diaspora in Africa, as well as music and visual culture. He's the author of many books and essays, including Race Rebels, Culture, Politics, and the Black Working Class, Hammer and Hoe, Alabama Communists During the Great Depression, Freedom Dreams, The Black Radical Imagination, and Thelonious Monk, The Life and Times of an American Original. So yeah, I'm really excited for this conversation. Thank you all for being here. I think it's really important for us to be discussing the relationship between the labor movement and Black liberation, especially in this moment after the summer's uprising and the ongoing pandemic and economic crisis. And for those of us who are socialists, especially in the DSA, this is a really significant moment to reorient our work and really contextualize the events of the last several months in terms of how we move forward. So before we get started, I just want to let folks know we'll have each speaker speak for about 25 minutes or so and then have a Q&A. This is a webinar, so throughout the time that the speakers are talking, I believe if there's Q&A at the bottom of your screen, you can send questions that we'll see and then we'll address them at the end. So yeah, without further ado, why don't you, go ahead, Michael.
Okay, well, thank you very much and welcome everybody. I'm going to start a little bit off script. Robin and I have known each other for a long time, and I wish to say that I'm a big fan of his work. You did want me to go first, Robin. And I've used many of his books in class. The one I have not used, and my favorite, and the one that probably has made him most famous, is his book on Thelonious Monk, who I heard at the Five Spot Cafe when I was staying nearby and what was then a slum, which now is called the East Village. So I was at the Detroit Jazz Festival when Robin's book came out, and Branford Marsalis was on stage with the great drummer Roy Haynes. And Branford said that the two of them had been talking, and this was by far the best jazz book that they had ever read. Good recommendations. So I was looking over the introduction to Freedom Dreams, and I was struck about Robin's emphasis on the importance of social movements for scholarship. So Robin and I, along with countless others, are the beneficiaries as scholars in the post-World War II struggles. These struggles start with the independence and anti-imperialist movements among people of color, the independence of India in 1947, the Chinese Communist Revolution 1949, the Algerian struggle. I'm probably going to leave some things out, but these are the highlights. 1959 to 1962, when the plebiscite took place and they became independents, and the South African struggle against apartheid, which went on for decades, negotiations beginning in 1990, and in 1994, the election of the ANC and Nelson Mandela as president. And above all, in the post-war period for us in the United States is the civil rights movement, whose modern incarnation begins in the 1930s and 1940s, blooming again in the 1950s and 1970s, laying the basis for a huge upsurge of scholarship on the Civil War and Reconstruction, which basically blew away the racist scholarship that dominated for the century beforehand. And in retrospect, it is totally shocking how utterly racist but universally accepted this historiography was. The dean of this was Aldrich Bunnell Phillips, careful scholar, dean of social historians at Columbia University, not as I remember a Southern university. And this was what I was taught in 7th grade, shocking stuff. And in my opinion, equally culpable and dishonest, but not having yet been blown away, are the Cold War historians of the labor movement, glorifying the racist authoritarian liberals like Walter Reuther and Philip Murray and many others. And my own path to understanding the issues has been a long one. In the 1960s, W.E.B. Du Bois, who I consider the greatest social scientist of the 20th century, was a marginalized figure. I encountered him in a late 60s study group led by some ex-Communist Party people, and where we read parts of Black Reconstruction. Du Bois is, of course, eulogized by almost everybody who looks at him these days. The 1960s is also, I want to suggest, totally distorted by historians and especially by the media. While the culture is certainly important, that's all that's talked about, and in my opinion, was a product of the movements and not even the main thing. I didn't particularly like the Beatles, who said that if you're talking about revolution, you can count them out. I preferred the Stones' Street Fighting Man. But above all, as an activist in the civil rights movement, I loved Nina Simone singing Mississippi Goddamn, which was banned on TV and radio in Mississippi. And the 60s, just an aside for me, I was working in a plant in Chicago, and a group of us would go to the Chicago Bulls games. Tickets were cheap, $1 or $2 for the nosebleed seats in the balcony. Of course, we were unionized factory workers, so we could afford the $3 mezzanine seats. That would be like paying $20 today for Madison Square Garden seats. And we would go there. And so this was a predominantly young, working class, mostly, not all, crowd, probably a quarter to a third African American, and they'd play the national anthem, and no one would stand up. If you were Black, there was the civil rights movement. Fred Hampton had just been murdered. Everybody was against the war. And someone once said to me, why didn't some of the other more patriotic people stand up? And I said, they were intimidated by the rest of us. So for me, that's the 60s. So Du Bois, reading Du Bois led me to seeing the importance of the South for all American society, including how we got to Donald Trump. If I don't run out of time, I'll talk to a little bit at the end, which I discuss at length in my book, The Color of Politics, and also The Southern Key, which just came out. So Du Bois says that the key to understanding why no socialism in the United States, American exceptionalism, is really why there's no liberalism in the South. This has to do with slavery, the cotton plantation, and this is still the case today. Why no liberalism in the South? So where was the labor movement when we were involved in the civil rights movement, particularly white workers during the 60s and 70s in the South? Why were they missing in action? And this I eventually found to be rooted in the successful and unsuccessful struggles of the 30s and 40s, which often fought for racial justice, as Robin documents carefully in his first book, Hammer and Hoe. So I became interested in how many of these initial interracial civil rights-oriented labor struggles, starting in steel, were destroyed. And in steel, they were destroyed by the Murray leadership after the union was organized. And how did this leadership end up allying itself with the Ku Klux Klan in Alabama, destroying Black-led civil rights locals of the mine mill and smelter workers union? But there were other places beside Alabama where interracial civil rights oriented unions dominated the terrain for a while. But Alabama is important because for a while, what I call in my book, Southern Key, Alabama exceptionalism existed to greater or lesser degrees all across the South. But Alabama was the high point. That Alabama is a peculiar place because along with Mississippi, South Carolina, Louisiana, and Georgia, it was the heart of the Deep South. First slave, then sharecropper growing cotton, states that had overwhelmingly large percentages of African Americans. Controlled by black belt plantation owners and their industrial allies in Birmingham, voting for the white supremacist, racist, states' right Dixiecrat presidential candidate Strom Thurmond of South Carolina in 1948, who, by the way, Joe Biden has bragged that he'd been friends with and was able to work together with. Fervent supporter of the overtly racist Governor George Wallace in 1964 and 1968, Alabama seems an unlikely place for interracial liberalism and radicalism to have taken root. The state was as gerrymandered and jerry-rigged as any state in the South or the country in favor of rich white cotton plantation owners, enshrined in the 1901 Alabama State Constitution. Even in the 1960s, for example, Lowndes County, the 1,600 whites there had equal representation at the state level to the 500,000 citizens living in Jefferson County, which included Birmingham. The 23,000 blacks in Lowndes County, as elsewhere in much of Mississippi, were completely disenfranchised. Lynchings, chain gangs, rigid segregation were part of the scene. Yet in 1946, the CIO endorsed left populist James Big Jim Folsom was elected governor. The ever optimistic Nation declared Alabama the most liberal state in the South. Well, Folsom was a bit unique. Even in Alabama, he wasn't alone. In contrast to most other Southern governors, he not only argued for more opportunities for blacks, he explicitly said, and there's a quote, "Race is a phony issue, a ploy used by the rich and powerful to divide poor people and blind them to their common interests." He opposed the poll tax. He argued that all African Americans in Alabama should have the right to vote. He made a point of welcoming African Americans to his campaign rallies. And even as the storm of white backlash was sweeping across Alabama and the rest of the South, Folsom, who had been elected for a second term in '54, in November of 1955, he not only invited the very flamboyant African-American Harlem Congressman Adam Clayton Powell of the State House, but had a limousine pick him up at the airport and was photographed in the governor's mansion drinking scotch with him. He called the near unanimous resolution of the Alabama legislature declaring the 1954 Brown decision, Supreme Court decision, null and void in Alabama. He said this was a bunch of hogwash. So I'm not suggesting that Folsom was a militant civil rights activist or a consistent integrationist, but merely that he was outside the Dixiecrat consensus that ruled much of Southern politics at the time. So why did Alabama, a hardcore, deep South Dixiecrat state, appear so different at the time? What made Alabama exceptional was the 1940s. It was the most unionized state in the South. Union membership had increased from 70,000 to over 200,000 in 1945. 25% of the labor force in that year was organized in unions. And to put this in perspective, there is no state in the United States today that has the level of unionization that Alabama had in 1945. Labor movement was centered in Birmingham, the stronghold of the interracial United Mine Workers. The roughly 23,000 unionized mine workers in Alabama were the vanguard of the labor movement, aiding in the organization of all other workers across the state, including steel workers, woodworkers, textile workers, school teachers, even principals in one counties, and farmers across the state. There were also industrial enclaves across the state where textile and other factory workers were organize. And the coal miners provided leadership and support for all these struggles. Textile workers in Alabama were among the earliest to organize in a difficult to organize industry. And they were the vanguard of, the textile workers were the vanguard of the events leading up to the 1934 textile general strike, and by far the strongest contingent in the South. So Southern workers organized in the 30s and 40s across a large number of industries, including coal, metal mining, longshore, auto, steel, oil, meat slaughtering, farm equipment, and others. And even industrial centers outside of Alabama, including Memphis, Tennessee, New Orleans, Atlanta, Laurel, Jackson, and Natchez, Mississippi. In Laurel, Mississippi, a town of 30,000 inhabitants, and still today a plywood center as it was then, the industrial union movement, the CIO, had more than 6,000 members. In late 1948, the Textile Workers Union won an election at the Laurel Mill. It was the last non-union plant in town. And the victory came despite the fact that openly white supremacist Senator Theodore Bilbo and Representative John Rankin came to town specifically to campaign against the CIO, which, unlike the auto workers' defeat in Chattanooga, Tennessee in 2014, did not stop the majority white workers there from voting for the CIO. Yet unions were defeated in the two largest Southern industries, textile and wood. In other places, their unions often degenerated into tepid organizations, failing to challenge the racist status quo. None of this, I argue, was predetermined. So what remained after these defeats were certain isolated beacons of hope that existed in the 1950s, but which also show the way for what I believe labor unions should be doing today as signs of the future. So I'm going to give a couple examples of these, which I think are important, and there are lots more. So the farm equipment workers, which was a left-wing union, less than 100,000 members, had a number of civil rights-oriented plants. They were marginalized and attacked by the powerful auto workers under Walter Reuther with over 1 million members, and they were supported in these attacks by the federal government, the House Un-American Activities Committee, the FBI, and the police. In their plant in Louisville, which they won overwhelmingly in an election in 1946, a plant that was little more than 10% African American, the union went about desegregating the plant, locker rooms, lunch rooms, showers, the whole bit, and they fought in the community with interracial groups sitting in at parks, hotels, restaurants, and swimming pools, successfully integrating things in Louisville, which had never been done before. At the foundry in Louisville, which was later won by the Rutherites, which was 50% African American, in the 1950s, the whole plant was still segregated. And this is documented fairly well in a new book and in an earlier thesis by Tony Gilpin. The farm equipment workers in Chicago, along with the packing house workers, led the fight for civil rights in the 50s. The same was true in the River Rouge Ford local just outside Detroit, local 600. The food and tobacco workers in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, immortalized in Robert Corsted's work. To give some more detail, Local 10, the San Francisco local of the Longshoremen's Union, which was initially overwhelmingly white, fought for hiring Black longshoremen. And when layoffs came, they initially refused to follow seniority, which would have laid off the last hired Black longshoreman. They fought in the community among a number of racial issues, including hiring of Black bus drivers. The first ones were beaten up by white racists. The longshoremen then rode 5 or 6 burly longshoremen along with the bus drivers, and the attacks ended. All the while being attacked by the national NAACP. The local, of course, was sympathetic to the union, and anti-communist liberals. And this story goes on and on. So I just read a dissertation by Matt Nichter on the origins of the civil rights movement. The packing house workers in 1955 sent an interracial delegation, all but one of whose members was from the South, to attend the trial of Emmett Till's murderers. A white sugary refinery leader, Grace Falkus from Louisiana, was warned outside the Sumner, Mississippi courthouse that something might happen to her if she continued to mix with Negroes. And quote from the newspaper article, because we don't do that here. She looked them straight in the eye and she said, "We just love to mix." And if you want to spend time in Louisiana, as I have, and I also have relatives in a small town south of Shreveport, and I don't want to go into what some of them are at right now, but one can easily imagine the accent with which she said this to them. The packing house workers whose stronghold was in Chicago had worked with Till's mother, convincing her to have the open casket so that people could see what had been done to her son, Emmett Till. The packing house workers wanted a national-wide demonstration against lynching and publicizing Till, but this was sabotaged by Herbert Hill, who was working for the NAACP, who was later found to be an FBI informant, and other liberal anti-communists in the NAACP and the much lauded A. Philip Randolph. So these are parts of history that need to still be explored and straightened out, something I try to do a little bit of in the Southern Key. When we can take some early guidance from two Marxist scholars and activists and brilliant scholars, here I disagree with Robin a little bit, whose work and alleged break with Marxism, in my opinion, is greatly distorted by Cedric Robinson, W.E.B. Du Bois, and C.L.R. James. And my friend John Bracey, who spent a lot of time with C.L.R. James toward the end of his life, told me that James would have been recoiled at being called a black Marxist rather than just a Marxist. In the end, the civil rights unionism was largely defeated or abandoned in the country as a whole, especially in the South. And the consequences of that defeat were the isolation of civil rights unionism. So the unwillingness of virtually all industrial unions in the South to participate in the 1950s, 1970s civil rights movement in any way other than giving verbal support, which is especially true of the steel workers and the UAW auto workers, two powerful, ostensibly pro-civil rights unions, undercut the possibilities for support from white workers, effectively isolating the civil rights movement from potential coalitions with interracial organization. In general, there were only a couple unions that actually mobilized their members for civil rights. Local 1199, now a big hospital union, but originally a small union of several hundred left-wing Jewish druggists, and the packing house workers, both of which bust their members in both civil rights and anti-war demonstrations in the 60s, and the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Workers, as suggested in the union organizing in Memphis, where Martin Luther King was assassinated while aiding their struggle, also at times merged their campaigns with those of the civil rights movement. And in the end, the civil rights movement, for all its heroic struggles and important successes, not the least of which were gaining voting rights in the Deep South for African Americans and ending police and Ku Klux Klan terror in the Black Belt counties of the Deep South, including Mississippi, was not able to confront the economic roots of white supremacy. And for any of us who've been down to Mississippi, particularly the Delta in the recent period, you sometimes think that maybe you're in a third world country, that you're not in someplace in the United States. Class-based racial issues that had the potential to unite white and black workers never got off the ground. These failures led almost inexorably to the success of white backlash in the South and the mobilizations of whites in opposition to civil rights. Massive resistance in the South begins shortly after the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision. For a variety of reasons, this backlash drew support from working class and poor whites. With little resistance from organized labor, opposition was effectively crushed. Have a long list of all sorts of terrible things that were done in terms of crushing opposition. The Republican Party set out to win racist rights in the South in order to expand its base. This approach was pushed strongly in 1961 by Barry Goldwater, who was head of the 1962 Senatorial Campaign Committee. This strategy was named aptly Operation Dixie. His 1964 presidential campaign, according to commentators, was a barely veiled attempt to appeal to racial hatred. His all-white rallies in the South were, as one commentator said, great carnivals of white supremacy. And none of this do we see in established histories about the development of conservatism in the Republican Party. George Wallace had tremendous supports of whites in the South and even got a lot of support for whites in the North. So in 1968, Richard Nixon attempted to appropriate the racist Wallace message in more veiled terms. His strategist, Kevin Phillips, in a path-breaking 1970 book called The New Republican Majority, laid out this strategy, faithfully followed by Republican candidates since then. Ronald Reagan, whitewashed still today, campaigned against Black crime, welfare crimes, and forced busing, even kicking off his 1980 and 1984 post-convention re-election campaigns in Philadelphia, Mississippi, the site of the 1964 kidnapping and brutal murder and torture of 3 civil rights martyrs, James Chaney, Michael Schwerner, and Andrew Goodman. From George H.W. Bush's racist Willie Horton ads, a senior Bush being currently extolled as the humanitarian Republican alternative to Donald Trump. We have a straight line with lots of other, to the 2016 presidential election, the racist, xenophobic Donald Trump. The Republican message has been consistent. Democrats themselves were not blameless, from Jimmy Carter's calls for racial purity to the Chicago Democratic Machine's racist attacks on 1983 Democratic mayoral candidate, African-American Harold Washington. William Clinton's campaign reaching new lows with his attacks on Sister Souljah, his ordering of the death row execution of a mentally deficient Black prisoner, his support for the gutting of welfare, and on, things which people are mostly familiar with. So I would argue that the failures and successes of Southern labor organizations in the 30s and 40s remain the key to understanding the trajectory of American politics, much of contemporary American society, and also create some of the guidelines for what we need to do in the present period to overcome that. Lots of hopeful signs, which maybe we can talk about in the Q&A, or maybe Robin will be talking about too. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. I can just jump in, right?
Yeah.
It's so great to, Mike and I haven't had a really good long conversation in a while. So it's so great to be reminded, like, for the last 30 years, I have been, listening and learning from him. And even though he's a trained political scientist, back in those days, he hung out with historians, let me tell you, because I was at all those conferences, in all those debates, in all those meetings. And he's just really a mention just in terms of really being committed to struggle. So I really appreciate being here with him and with DSA. So let me just jump right in. And we do have to have a conversation about Cedric Robinson at some point, because he if you read my new introduction for the new issue that's coming out, the new edition is coming out in next year, like in February, there's a lot of clarity. He doesn't exactly call James a Black Marxist, In fact, he doesn't call anyone black Marxist. He talks about the limits of Marxism, but that's another debate we can have, which may come up. Anyway, so just, it's interesting to have this conversation. It's important to note, and I'm glad that Michael started with anti-imperialism, with the global situation. That's the place to begin, because right now, the most important story that we need to think about is the fact that there are 250 million workers and farmers and students out on strike in India. It's the largest general strike in human history, and hardly anyone's talking about it. And yet here, in some ways, it represents the most important lessons for the hour. That is the lesson of who is the working class, what's working class composition, where are they located? I mean, even when we talk about labor history on a global scale, and I know our focus today is on the United States, there's a way in which there's a tendency to fall back on a kind of European, Eurocentrism, US centrism, and the urban over the rural. And yet, one of the things that I learned from Cedric Robinson, but also I've been teaching for the last 3 decades, is that the largest workers' revolts in the 20th century were not in Europe, were not in the US, but were in the colonies. You know, when you talk about just sheer numbers. So, but today we're talking about the US and organized labor and Black workers. And I want to acknowledge a couple of things. I'm gonna skip over a lot because Michael beautifully laid it out. So I want to first acknowledge that Black workers have often been at the forefront of the labor movement. You know, Mike mentions Du Bois. I mean, Du Bois's Black Reconstruction made that point, especially in the 19th century. Back in the days when labor parties and mass organizations, you know, were predominant, the Knights of Labor, the Greenback Labor Party, and certain unions, Black workers provided leadership to white workers, or at least they tried, in the Colored National Labor Union, in the Brotherhood of Sleeping-Car Porters, in the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, which I'll say something about, in the Coalition of Black Trade Unions. Black labor militants appealed to whites and other workers of color for solidarity. And a lesson here is that when white workers attempted to go it alone, especially in the 19th century, or build these exclusionary racist unions, they don't win. And this is one of the main lessons we've learned from Michael's talk. They don't win. We could look at the 1866 campaign for an 8-hour day. In St. Louis, Unionists built a biracial campaign and won. In New Orleans, a lily white campaign for an 8-hour day went down in defeat. So much of the story of labor is a familiar one. And it's the one about, you know, how capitalists deploy racism as a weapon along with force, how they use the coercive arm of the state to put down strikes or contract out convict labor, which is still happening today with prison labor, bribe conservative Black leaders to oppose unions and break strikes, foment mob violence in the name of protecting white womanhood or fighting communism. But it's also important to acknowledge also, as Mike did, that trade unions were exclusionary. Not always, but in some ways, the original trade unions were not meant to be inclusive. They were based on skilled trades. They were based on protecting jobs. There were exceptions, obviously, the IWW, the CIO. I mean, we can go on. And it wasn't just Black workers who were being excluded, which brings me to really the crux of the matter. And for me, the real question is less about the labor movement supporting Black liberation. But for me, the question is, why has so much of the US labor movement refused to embrace the entire class? Why has it had such a narrow understanding of what the class is, excluding Black workers, excluding Asian workers, excluding agricultural and domestic workers? Why have so many unions consistently supported or tolerated a racially segmented labor force or wage differentials based on race? And clearly there are exceptions, because that's what the whole talk, Michael's brilliant talk, was about, these really important exceptions and where we could have gone. I'm going to say a little bit about that in a second, but let's talk about other policies, housing policies that not only maintain segregation, but devalue homes in Black and mixed neighborhoods and boost the value for white ownership in segregated neighborhoods. This is a working class issue. policies that exclude Black people from publicly funded institutions like better schools, better hospitals, healthcare. And of course, some may say, well, this has nothing to do with the labor movement. Well, it has everything to do with the labor movement. Spatial segregation, for example, wasn't just the product of Jim Crow laws and edicts, but operations of racial capitalism. And it explains so much. It explains why the workplace itself cannot be like the main or singular focus. Because part of what happens with the relationship between labor and capital, racial capitalism, are the hidden costs of living. The fact that some people live in food deserts, that people have limits on mobility to access decent jobs due to transportation, that home and property values is a source of wealth and some people don't have access to that, that school funding is affected, services like libraries are affected. And that means, like, just imagine what it means, for example, in this pandemic, for all these poor working class Black and brown kids to do online schooling by using the internet at McDonald's because they don't have access to the internet. And this is what we mean by sort of racial capitalism, which not only produces deep inequalities by race, but kept and still keeps a segment of the white working class in a state of precarity, while convincing them that Black and brown people are to blame. Now, we can frame this in terms of supporting Black liberation, which I think has its benefits, or we can frame it in terms of the overthrow of racial capitalism, which some may say is just utopian. But ultimately, the hidden secret of the system is, of racial capitalism's longevity, is the capacity of capital in the state to capture so much of the white working class and tie its identity to race and masculinity. So if there's anyone who needs liberating, you might think about the white working class instead of Black liberation, but we'll talk about that. Now, of course, there are these amazing exceptions, and that's exactly the crux of I think, Mike's brilliant presentation. And so I'm not going to talk about those at all. In fact, I had some and I'm going to skip over them. But I want to just add on, and these are things that Michael's written about, a couple of things that he didn't have time to mention, but I think it's really, really important to remember that the success of so many of these unions in the mid-century, especially after World War II, like FTA, for example, benefited from what he writes about so eloquently, the 1945-46 strike wave, which, was extremely important as the wind behind the back of even the failed campaigns, but it's very important context. And these rebellions, these insurgencies were short-lived as a result of the state and corporate response to post-war labor insurgency. The collective power of labor, especially in cases of really exemplary interracial cooperation, like the examples that Michael presented, these threatened to severely curtail corporate power, or worse, usher in a new political order that might impose greater regulation on business, expand the welfare state, and undermine corporate profits. It's not an accident that, Hayek's Road to Serfdom is written in 1944, takes off in 1945 as a kind of, hedge against the growing power of labor. It's not just a response to fascism, but collectivism is about the growing power of labor. So what we get is a ramping up of a war on labor in the name of anti-communism. And I think anti-communism, whether or not we could talk about the effectiveness or lack thereof of the Communist Party, and I totally agree with Mike on this, that there's no single left. There's like, we can't be sort of vague about who the left is. There's particular segments of the left that play different roles in the formation and development of the labor movement in the post-war period. But anti-communism was this blanket weapon. And, so we get the passage of Taft-Hartley, which restricted workers' right to strike, outlawed closed shops, secondary boycotts, and sympathy strikes, imposed really hefty fines on union officials who failed to oppose unauthorized strikes, prevented unions from contributing to political campaigns, required union officers to sign loyalty oaths, in affidavits affirming that they're not communists. And some of the unions, of course, didn't, like FTA and some of the left-led unions. And of course, we also see the expulsion of those unions from the CIO. But this is not the end of the story. And I appreciate what Michael was saying about the backlash. And I wanna just add one little dimension to that in terms of the continuation of a labor politics, kind of pro-labor politics within this framework of the civil rights movement and what happened to it. Like, how did it didn't exactly disappear, but it shifted. And that shift has everything to do with movements being combined and uneven, but we could talk about that. So there's this mythology that still circulates that the civil rights movement moved its agenda completely away from labor and economic justice to desegregation of public accommodations, neutralizing labor's role. And it's just not exactly true. Yes, there were some red baiting going on and elements of the movement that did push the middle class agenda. And I'm gonna talk about that in a second. But I want to revisit the civil rights movement, the formal civil rights movement as we know it, even beginning with the March on Washington, for example. I mean, the March on Washington in 1963 was at its core about two things. One, ending racist violence. And I appreciate what Mike was saying about the labor response to Emmett Till's murder. We could talk about that as well. But the second thing, of course, was securing economic justice, that is, especially jobs. The brainchild behind it both had roots in socialist and labor movements, although they turned out to be kind of reactionary in the end. We could talk about that, but Bayard Rustin and the veteran Black labor leader, A. Philip Randolph. And, most people on this webinar, I'm sure, have read some portion of Randolph's speech at the March on Washington, because it circulated very widely, where he talks about, labor, and he kind of quotes Marx. But then you have the Negro American Labor Council, which Michael also talks about. It was a lead sponsor in the March on Washington. It had organized local marches under the slogan, freedom from poverty through fair and full employment, and threatened to hold a national one-day work stoppage to pressure Congress to pass the Civil Rights Bill. It also fought to raise the federal minimum wage and extend its coverage to all workers. It backed efforts to organize domestic workers, to abolish HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee, to build up the American Labor Party as a third-party alternative. So what happened to this vision of economic justice? Well, a couple of things. One, some of the big groups like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Congress on Racial Equality, the NAACP, which has its own very problematic relationship to labor, as we know with the Herbert Hill story, and the Urban League threw its energies almost entirely behind passing the kind of watered down civil rights bill and supporting a voting rights bill under President Johnson. And their focus then was on trying to influence the Democratic Party, hint, 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 okay? Second, the labor movement betrayed the coalition's racial justice agenda. So rank and file white members worried those who depended on a union protection for a kind of, wage differentials or occupational ceilings that are racially defined. They worried that the elimination of racial barriers to equal wages, access to skilled jobs, and unfettered access to housing would threaten their privileged status. That's another thing. A third thing that happened, which we don't always talk about, is that Randolph and other leaders deliberately excluded Black women's organizations from playing any significant role in the movement. And this weakened the labor coalition because a lot of the Black women were actually tied to labor organizing. People like Pauli Murray, Anna Hedgeman, Dorothy Robinson, Gloria Richardson, Rosa Parks, Dorothy Height, they had already committed to linking labor and economic justice to questions of racial and gender equity. But having said that, that did not mean the end of a kind of economic justice labor agenda. Because if we go back and we look at the history of SNCC, for example, or the history of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which I'm so glad that Michael brought up Mississippi, because Mississippi, I would argue, even to this moment, in Jackson, for example, it is like the center of class struggle. It's like so much going on that has been going on. But let's go back to Mississippi. So they not only embraced a program of economic justice, but went further, calling for the redistribution of wealth, for reparations and workers' power. And in fact, in 1963, SNCC's Freedom Vote campaign in Mississippi promoted a platform that included the right of labor to organize and engage in collective bargaining, $1.25 minimum wage, support for farm cooperatives in place of sharecropping and dispossession, a provision of low interest loans for small farmers, a progressive land tax on tracts of land over 500 acres, and tax exemption for those plots smaller than 500 acres. SNCC had helped organize the Mississippi Freedom Labor Union, which organized mainly agricultural workers in the Delta. And in the spring of 1965, about 350 members of the MFLU, mainly cotton choppers, went on strike to demand that $1.25 an hour. The planters wouldn't budge. Instead, they evicted the workers. So in January 1966, when the Greenville Air Force Base was about to be sold, strikers occupied it. It's a very dramatic story. They attempted to focus federal attention on their plight, and the Air Force, of course, the Air Force Police expelled them. The strikers created Tent City, known as Strike City. They appealed to liberal organizations and government for food, clothing, and other commodities. And they lost the struggle in some respects, but what they did was, they lost because they didn't have the economic leverage to force planters to meet their demands. And they didn't have substantive government support, so they were defeated. But that defeat really did profoundly shape the politics of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which somehow we think ended in 1964. It's like they left Atlantic City, went back home and said, oh, well, we don't need to do this anymore. But in fact, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party expanded, grew, and in fact became even more radical and pursued a radical economic vision when even middle-class Black Mississippians were trying to move into the mainstream of the Democratic Party. Let me just share a couple other examples before closing. One is that radical vision continued in other places. Michael mentioned Local 600, UAW. Well, Detroit in particular was the home of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, which began as, before it became the League, as a wildcat strike of auto workers in May of 1968, led by General Baker and others. 4,000 workers at the Dodge main plant were, basically striking over a speed up on the assembly line. And unfortunately, most of the workers didn't support the strike, but out of this action was born the Dodge Revolutionary Union Movement, or DRUM. And those strikes spread to the Eldon Avenue Gear and Axle plant, Elrum, to the Ford Revolutionary Union Movement and DRUM's basic specific demands included things like safer workplaces, slowing down the production line, lowering production demands, ending racist hiring practices, and all these, echoed kind of past grievances. And of course, they wanted to win better working conditions and better wages for Black workers, but their ultimate goal, when it came down to it, when you read the inner city voice and in their own publications, was freedom for all workers, and that meant an end to capitalism. So this is, why in 1969 all the leaders of the various revolutionary union movements came together and formed the League with this long-term goal of becoming a political party or a revolutionary movement. And there was a debate about that. It eventually split, and I'm not going to go into all that. But DRUM and the League consistently battled the leadership of the UAW, who, again, Walter Reuther is seen as like some kind of heroic figure because he was friendly to Dr. King. But UAW was like one of the albatross. the gatekeeper who not only tried to crush the Revolutionary Union movement, but called the police to break up their meeting, and relied on violence to undermine their campaign to elect a member of Drum to the Board of Trustees of the UAW. And Drum members knew that racism, and they said this, racism limited the ability of workers to unite, and not just Black workers, affected Black workers, but white workers, Arab workers, other workers on the line. And so they argued that white workers, though they benefit from racism in some form, with higher wages, cleaner and safer jobs, in the long run, they're not really benefiting. Even though Ron March, who was running for a place on the Board of Trustees, would have fought for all workers, fought harder against speed ups, and but to many white workers, he was seen as a threat to leadership. There are some places where there were some great victories. We should go back and look at Greensville, North Carolina in the 1990s, where the campaign against Walmart was great victory, and partly because they fought at the community level, compelling the city council to pass living wage requirements for companies coming to the city like Walmart. And so much of the work, was about passing some laws, making some changes in municipal and state government to improve the condition of workers. So final words on this, just to end, because I want to get the conversation. To go back to the Indian General Strike, it really tells us that we really need to rethink the composition of the working class, especially at this moment. We always have to rethink the composition of working class. The 19th century is not the same as the 30s, not the same as the 50s, not the same as the 70s, not the same as the moment we're in. When we shift our attention from the kind of big industrial unions, which played such a critical role in mid-century into the later 20th century, and we imagine the working class, residing in those spaces, we then have to turn our attention to the low-wage, marginalized workers in fast food, retail, healthcare, home care, domestic work, agriculture always, workers who have to survive on involuntary part-time work, on short-term contracts, on 0 hours contracts, on telemarketing, and that includes home workers as well as prison labor, and the concierge economy, Uber, Lyft, Grubhub. When we look at the labor movement from that vantage point, the horizon looks radically different. The strategies required are somewhat different. And I don't want you to think I'm saying this is where everything should reside. There's still a UAW, there's still, General Electric, there's still, industrial labor. And if you think about manufacturing, global manufacturing is greater than ever, when we get outside the United States. So I don't want to say that when these things should be ignored, but it means that we do have to think about these other domains of work and what lean production means in terms of transforming work. The once powerful engines of racial and gender exclusion, which have been unions in many cases, often working with capital to impose glass ceilings and racially segmented wages. In the 21st century, there's labor movements that are building on the ethos, the culture, the political culture that Michael's talking about in mid-century, that in other words, embracing the principles of social justice, embracing anti-racism, embracing immigrant rights, cross-border strategies. We're seeing that now. And it seems like the new labor leaders, they look different. They're teachers, they're nurses, they're healthcare workers. And by the way, Gabriel Winan has this great book coming out, which looks at Pittsburgh and the transition from steel to healthcare and who the healthcare workers are actually dealing with. They're clerical workers, they're fast food workers, they're flight attendants, and among others. They've adopted new strategies from passing minimum wage laws at the municipal state level, using community benefits agreements to secure living wage jobs, trying to fight for equitable working conditions, using them to instill sort of green building practices, affordable housing, childcare provisions. And you see, even though there's a kind of sense that the labor movement, whatever it is kind of withdrawing, there's some moments of great alliances between the movement for Black Lives, for example, and immigrant rights activists in campaigns such as Our Walmart, the Fight for 15, Change to Win. These are all, I think, leading the way to building, I think, what could be the most dynamic labor movement we've ever seen in our lifetime. So I'm very optimistic about the future, but it requires a kind of rethinking, re-strategizing, and rebuilding, which is going to require a lot of work. So I'm going to stop there so we can have a conversation.
Excellent. Thank you two so much. I think I see one question. I'm actually just going to wait for some others to slide in. One question that I just think is really essential, and either one of you can jump in, is sort of kind of what are the implications of Black liberation right now for the labor movement, especially considering, right? I think it's sort of hard for us to sort of see and parse out because we're still sort of in the midst for this, but there's a relationship between the way the pandemic hit communities of color and Black communities in particular, and the sort of incredible, Black rebellion we saw this summer. And I'm just, something that I've just sort of been thinking, and I think, important for labor organizers and socialists to be thinking about is what can the labor movement really be learning from the state of Black liberation right now? I don't know who wants to start, or Robin.
Yeah, I'll let Michael go first.
So I think among the interesting things about the pandemic, aside from the fact, almost none of this, including the general strike in India, was reported in the New York Times, which I don't want to go off on this, but looking at their history, I consider them a right-wing paper, always slandering demonstrators, never reporting labor struggles and whatnot. But I think in the current new economy, and one of the things I talk about in my book is what types of workers have structural power, like coal miners did, and what people don't have much, like textile workers. But it's clear in the current economy, those people in warehouses, the logistic clusters, have an awful lot of leverage at the current time. And they've been very difficult to organize. But I think the pandemic has not only emphasized how critical they are for the rest of us, but it's encouraged them, given the unsafe conditions and that they've been in, to organize in a way that they haven't been able to previously. Workers in the food processing, food distribution, and logistic and warehouse industries are disproportionately female, non-white. And it seems to me that while it's somewhat inchoate at the present time, that the demands in terms of discrimination as well as safety and unionization, and a lot of this is popping up on the web. There's a picture in Alabama, and Robin will appreciate this, in one of the old mine mill strongholds where Amazon has this huge warehouse, and these workers are all holding union signs. And so for the first time, these Amazon warehouses, we see some big momentum taking place. So I think the prospects for renewal of the labor movement are really important. And what's happening in India, and hopefully in China too, China is has a majority of what we would consider proletarian labor in the whole world. Very difficult situation. Indian workers, and I've actually, there's a book that I don't think too many people read. I co-wrote a book on India with a colleague and labor economist in Calcutta. I've been in Calcutta, formerly known as Calcutta, during general strikes there. It's a one that until recently, the communists controlled the government. The labor unions were strong. But Indian workers have had a hard time organizing, in part because so many of them are peripheral, non-permanent workers. This general strike, which you could find in foreign papers on the web, but not in the New York Times, that took place on November 26th, just before Thanksgiving, was called by over 100 farmers organizations and by every major labor union in the country. Some of these unions organized peripheral workers, truckloaders, head carriers, people who carry baskets around on their heads, which have to be trained. It's a skilled, I consider it a skilled job. I've tried it and I can't keep a basket going. Rag pickers, who tend to be Dalits, the people with the very untouchables at the very bottom, women at the bottom of the racial hierarchy. So there's a certain amount of solidarity developed there. And I think, as we found with movements in general, big events like these general strikes tend to have an electrifying impact at other places. So I think the combination of things happening in the US by people who are affected by the pandemic, and healthcare workers too. Healthcare workers are unevenly organized. Nurses are well organized, but hardly any other category of healthcare workers are very well organized in the US. The conditions that people have been facing during the pandemic are pretty horrific. Public sector workers have been re-energized. The red states have been the worst because the Republican budget cuts have been worse than in other states. So it's inspiring to see Oklahoma and West Virginia school teachers statewide en masse. So it's hard to predict what's going to happen, but this is an exciting time with lots of potential insurgency taking place. We shall see.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I would add a couple of things. One, because I was looking at the chat and people like, what labor movement? And that's a really legitimate critique, that the labor movement is not what it used to be, not that it ever was what it used to be. But I think there's a couple of things to look at. One is that we have to acknowledge that the labor movement is as a movement is incredibly weak, because so many of the most visible struggles that we see are oftentimes settlements, negotiations, that the big labor unions are doing more givebacks. We saw this, the 2019 UAW strike, for example, which was a settlement. I mean, people struggled hard. I think people want to do better, but Michael's right that, there's a difference between the moment when the League of Revolutionary Black Workers was saying, look, so many Black workers actually occupy positions where we could stop production. That's not the case, now. Certainly warehouse workers, food processing, definitely. This is one of the places where there's real intense struggle. And it's not an accident that, with neoliberal policies, corporations have much stronger backing from the state to repress labor than they had even 40 years ago. And again, to go back, I don't, in Michael's work, he makes a really important point that you don't necessarily need to have a lot of labor protections from the state, that some of the greatest gains were made without those protections. So I'm not saying that that's the factor, but it is a factor in terms of the ability of a company like Amazon to really suppress its workers, and a culture, because that's the other thing, this has been a culture change in terms of neoliberal logic, neoliberal reason, that the problem with the economy is that workers in their fat unions and their fat pension funds is what's dragging down the economy. But it's the entrepreneurs and the 1% who are the drivers, they're the job makers, they're the ones who drive. I mean, this has become a common sense, you know, and that has actually had an impact in terms of mass support. However, I'm very excited about this moment we're in because the labor movement just doesn't look the same. It is the fight for 15. It is, workers who are making demands, and not necessarily wage demands, but demands even about sexual violence at the workplace and harassment and identity. I mean, these things are very, very important, but also we also have to recognize, what does it mean to fight capitalism? And I just want to give one real quick example here. There was a big debate, I remember this a few years ago, about whether or not anti-police violence struggles in the streets are anti-capitalist. And I remember the great, someone who I admire so much, David Harvey, brilliant, I learned so much from him, actually said, about Ferguson in North St. Louis County, that, I don't see much anti-capitalism going on there. And I would beg to differ, because these fights that we're witnessing are deeply anti-capitalist, not always, but if you look at Ferguson and the struggle to demand justice for Michael Brown, they were also fighting a predatory system of policing that used tickets and fees and fines and arrest warrants to extract millions of dollars from mostly poor Black people, and over police communities, and extending generous tax breaks to corporations. They were fighting the stripping of public schools of resources while corporations are getting tax abatements. These are the things that they're struggling against. And this is the nature, the sort of racist character of capitalism itself. But if we don't see those as fights that are anti-capitalist, and only see the ones that we recognize, then we won't see like where class struggle takes place. Class struggle, I would argue, is not always between organized labor and capital in a kind of traditional boxing ring sense. It's everywhere. And it takes on these kinds of struggles that, again, don't appear to look like the labor movement that we're used to 40, 50, 60 years ago.
Excellent. We definitely have quite a few questions rolling in. I think some of them overlap, so I think I'll address some of those larger questions and maybe get to some of these more specific questions. So one of these questions, if the labor movement previously excluded women, what is your assessment at this time of women's and Black women's level of integration in the labor movement, and what steps can be taken to improve this?
I have a couple things. Is it okay if I go, Robin? So I think the interesting thing, even as Will Jones, who's a real proponent of A. Philip Randolph and those people, acknowledges that they excluded Black women's groups and Black women from leadership. And that was also generally the history of the civil rights movement. But interesting, the communist-led National Legal Labor Council, in many of its campaigns, highlighted the hiring of Black women and had important Black female leadership. So in St. Louis, for example, they had big major demonstrations and demands for a new General Electric plant, which had hired lots of white women and no Black women, to start hiring Black women. This is a plant that was supposed to have 30,000 people in it. And so they highlighted these type of demands. And the United Electrical Workers was one of the few unions from the 30s and 40s that were particularly good at these demands. And I think one of the interesting things about the current period, and this starting with Ferguson, is that many of the leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement are Black women. And they're not just playing the traditional role, which both Robin and I see in our research from the 30s and 40s, where Black women provide the backbone of these unemployed struggles or civil rights struggles and never exist in leadership position. And that was true in the 60s too, from the NAACP and even in SNCC and SCLC. So we see Black women in the current period taking much more leadership roles and being acknowledged in those roles. And I see that as a hopeful sign in the current period. But we also have to recognize is that things are, that there is no major socialist, no less revolutionary party out there leading the struggles. Lots of demands get co-opted. So I look at the incredible struggles from the Black Lives Matter movement from the summer, underreported to be sure. I mean, it seems to me there were tens of millions of, when I look at cases, there were hundreds of towns, even overwhelmingly white towns in the northern and western part of the state that had thousands of people demonstrating. But on the other hand, corporations, while the underlying problems are structural, how much money can you put into the inner cities to redevelop them and to change education and housing, which Robin mentioned. There's all sorts of things that companies are giving money for. I mean, many of them are good things, right? Like supporting Black arts and whatnot, but they're not dealing with the fundamental problems and they don't plan on it. So one of the things that we find with the pandemic relief, for example, is that when the first relief came out, people were getting these checks and companies had warehouse employees and food distribution had trouble hiring. So they raised wages. They gave pandemic bonuses, right? When the money ran out, the bonuses disappeared, even though the pandemic and the risks were still there, right? So this sort of support from the federal government for people who were losing their jobs or in precarious and unsafe situations was only there when they had support. Amazon reinstituted as a bonus when 30 or 40,000 Amazon workers threatened to strike on Black Friday, right? So they didn't raise wages back up, but they gave people the $500, what they call them, Christmas bonuses or something. So the struggle is important. And I want to hark back to something from the 1940s and talk about what's wrong with the liberal strategies. So the UAW under Walter Reuther and the NAACP had an alliance to fight discrimination, right? So it turns out in Detroit, where there were almost 400,000 unionized auto workers, outside almost every one of these plants, the restaurants and bars were segregated. The NAACP and the UAW sent letters to all the restaurants and bars telling them to desegregate. Of course, nobody listened, right? In the left-wing locals, workers mobilized, put up sometimes hundreds of pickets outside the restaurants and bars, and they told the owners, you integrate or you won't get any customers. Integration took place the same day. So the type of thing that says, we need legislation, we need this, we need that, as opposed to struggle, or in contrast to struggle, isn't going to work. And it seems to me that that's the lesson that people have to learn. You have to strike, you have to shut things down, you have to organize. And the danger of co-optation, particularly without a large left-wing party leading things or focusing on demands, is important. I just want to focus one thing. And so I think Ferguson, the class issues in Ferguson are interesting, and the best case for saying it was anti-capitalist is this film that if you haven't seen it, you have to see it. It's called I think it's called Ferguson from Occupied Territory.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that film makes the case that these are class issues as well as class and racial issues combined, inseparable. So and there are struggles that continue to go on in Mississippi. One from a couple decades ago that I like the best is the organization of the catfish farms. And here we had broad solidarity. So here, as Robin says, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and the movement went on. Catfish, which used to be a junk food, garbage food, they ate garbage from the bottom of streams and only poor people ate them, became a delicacy, and they were grown on farms. Still a delicacy probably today. So some of these farms had as many as 1,000 workers on them, concentrated in Mississippi, and whole communities organized in support of workers striking, and most of the catfish farms in Mississippi were unionized. Also, again, very little reported in the press. So it's broad movements and solidarity taking place, helping workers that didn't have decisive leverages. And I think that's what happens to happen in terms of warehouse and other workers too. The rest of us have to be mobilizing in support of them. They can't just be left out on their own to struggle by themselves.
One last thing on Black women, because that was, I know, the initial question. Two countervailing responses, not really countervailing, but one is that Black women have actually always been at the real forefront of the labor movement. You know, if you think, I was going to talk about Local 22 of the FTA. I mean, everyone should know the names Miranda Smith, Velma Hopkins, Theodosia Simpkins, Viola Brown. I mean, these are really amazing militant women. St. Louis nut workers, for example, is another example. There's many, many examples. But at the same time, what we have witnessed is again, recomposition of the working class, where, you know, as white male membership of unions decline, I mean, I have numbers here from the 80s and 90s, where from 55.8% to 49.7% for white male workers, Black women's increase, you know, women's increase as a whole was 37% of organized labor by the end of the 90s, and it's higher now. So you think just out of the recomposition of the working class, you're going to see more women of color, more women, period, more Black women, not just in leadership positions, but at rank and file. And that's what the working class looks like. And again, one of the best examples is Pittsburgh, where you have this increasingly worker of color, feminized labor force, which replace what we imagine to be like Pittsburgh steel industry. And the victims of that steel industry are the ones who are under the care of this new labor force.
Thank you. Am I popping up here? Yeah, so there are actually, quite a few questions here sort of about what to do now about labor strategy. So I'm just going to try to compound some of these questions. So one of them pertains to sort of DSA. Maybe we can sort of more broadly think about, not particular to DSA, but socialist organization or party in general. So what would either of you suggest, based on your historical analysis, would be the most useful strategies, labor strategies, that, you know, for those of us in DSA within certain labor formations can use effectively to combat racism, especially because management obviously uses racism to divide workers? Yeah, I think that's sort of the general scheme of these questions.
Do you want to go, Robin, or you want?
Well, you know, I'm going to be brief because, you know, the questions I always hate are the ones that, where do we go from here? Because I'm like, you know, that's why we're having the conversation. We're supposed to figure it out together. You know, the platform is not so much to give knowledge from on high, but I'm thinking about the question that you posed, Marge, in terms of what I'm looking at as the questions about what constitutes a revolutionary demand versus a reformist demand. And, you know, I don't think anyone here would reject the idea of abolishing the wage slave system as the ultimate goal. But in reality, the question is, what do you do next? You know, like obviously, what does the form of class struggle take? What's realizable? And I think that one of the things that ends up happening is that when we come up with kind of universal claims and universal demands to do something immediately, that what ends up happening is that we don't see, again, the combined and uneven nature of the labor force and of capital itself. And in some places worth fighting for. I'm not going to say where to go from here, but one thing that does worry me is this idea that fighting against state violence, fighting against the carceral state, that these things are somehow side projects to the real project of bringing about a socialist revolution. And, you know, even though one could argue that the fight for 15 is just reformist, it's never really about just $15 an hour. It's about doing three things at once: changing the discourse on the way in which this system doesn't work for us, the way that people have to go on forms of public assistance, even if they're wage workers, just how ridiculously inhumane it is, and just to lay that out. Number two, how do you mobilize people in space? You know, so much of union movements wasn't about sort of fixing immediate problems, but actually creating the kind of social space to build solidarity, to be able to have these conversations and to figure out new ways of building a militant movement that could use forms of disobedience and opposition to the law to basically produce a crisis. So it's not about $15 an hour, you know. You know, for some people it is about that because they actually need that. And then from that, you start to talk about how to build power. And this is not something that you can sort of like figure out in a webinar, you know. But solidarity, and this is a third thing, I think that we got to think really hard about what does solidarity really look like. And sometimes solidarity means supporting struggles that may not directly affect us or what we think is as the core of labor. It may be at the edge or the margins, and yet produce some kind of both critique, illumination, and actually a wedge into other kinds of struggles. You know, so to me, that's what class struggle looks like. You know, it is fighting a predatory system of municipal finance and policing and state violence. It is making sure that we could try to end the alarming number of transgender people being killed by forms of not just the state, but other forms that are state sanctioned. You know, we need to be able to fight those fights because that's how you build solidarity. That's how you build community. And that's how you fight for power. You know, that's not the whole answer, but that's just some thoughts.
So I have some specific things. So I was part of a generation of people that after the 60s went into work in plants and shops to organize. And I did that for 10 years. And it wasn't that big a deal because I didn't think I should be in school anyway at the time. And I had worked my way through college as a machinist. So going back into a plant wasn't something that foreign. But even though I hadn't studied it and didn't call it that, our goal was to build civil rights unionism. And there are lots of people, through my book on the South, I've come into contact with a lot of people doing Southern labor organizing. And I would urge anybody who has the opportunity to do this to go into the workplace, whether it be a school, a hospital, a warehouse, or whatever, and do this. And the way that, and I'm not saying that we did everything perfect, but we were involved in a lot of what I would call quote unquote civil rights issues, including some having to do with anti-police violence. So we fought on safety and on speed up and all sorts of issues within this plant where I work. But our group also controlled the Fair Practice Committee. So we had two struggles that I want to mention that have something to do with this. First, there was a black worker in our plant who was not in our group, a fellow named C.B. Dennis, who bought a house in a white racist neighborhood about 2 miles from the plant that was firebombed twice. So we got the union we mobilized people, and we got the local to say that they would support him, and we had a picket line or outside his house 24 hours a day for almost 6 months. And we had signs from our local that we supported it. And from the first day we were there, although we had some drive-bys, there was no violence. And I'm not sure that the majority of white workers in our plant supported us, but if anything had happened to us on the picket line, the whole local would have been outraged. And so that's the advantage of civil rights unionism. No white racists in groups or individually wanted to mess with our local once we put up the picket line. The other thing that happened was that I was the chief steward on the main assembly line, and my alternate steward, who was African-American, got beat up by the police after he was in an accident with a white woman a couple miles from the plant. They dragged him out, they beat him up, he was in the hospital, and then they accused him of all sorts of things, right? So we mobilized defense at the local, including several hundred people at the first day of his trial. We got people from the National Lawyers Guild to defend him. We weren't very successful at having any suits or anything against the police, but we mobilized people from our local to defend it. We did a lot of publicity about the racist police and getting his side, our side of the story out there in all the Chicago area papers. So this seems to me what civil rights unionism is about. And if you can do this, it's often much more powerful than people acting as individuals. And we had interracial support on both of these issues. And this is what I argue could have happened with the Southern Civil Rights Movement under the proper leadership. So the interesting thing, one of the reasons that the farm equipment workers in Louisville had so much support among white workers is, first of all, they had higher wages because they were a militant local than any place else in Louisville. And they argued that this was because of their interracial solidarity, and they won a lot of white workers to seeing that. So it seems to me that these class solidaristic issues and anti-racist issues, as Robin suggested earlier, meld together under the right leadership. So I think that's the prospect now. And in some sense, given the preponderance of non-white, I don't know, say minority is probably not the useful term, and female workers in these situations putting forward these solidaristic arguments might even be easier in the present time than it was in more racist, more white times that existed in the 30s and 40s. So I think that's the goal. I would urge everybody who has a possibility to get involved in these struggles through jobs that they have or places that they would go. Some of these people I met in North Carolina have moved there to organize from other places. One fellow I talked to was involved in shutting down the warehouse where my publisher ships their books, so my books couldn't be shipped for a couple months, which was fine with me. It was sort of a comical aspect to things. So that's what I think people as individuals should be doing, aside from the fact of building socialist and revolutionary organizations to go with it. But in terms of practical activities, What should we do? That's what I think that we should do.
Yeah, I see. Let's go through this. All right, so anybody can jump in. So how do you think a Bernie Sanders presidency would have affected workers in America? And can Bernie's vision serve as a template for empowering workers?
Oh, okay. That's a question. Well, how do you think?
Me?
March? Yeah.
I mean, I think DSA, especially socialists, are wrestling with the sort of Bernie aftermath. Personally, I think it's a particularly unique era. I think more and more actually we'll be able to see it more within the scope of a certain kind of liberalism rhetorically, because I think there are a lot of similarities between the sort of portrait of hope from the Obama era, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But I do, in terms of, I think that there was a sense of popularizing certain kinds of ideas and policies to benefit workers in the working class, and some of that being somewhat of an extension of the 99% versus the 1%. So I think that there could have been certain gains, material gains met, but at the same time, I actually do think that there's a risk of demobilizing when we sort of jump to, I don't know how people want to put it, taking state power, which I wouldn't put it in those terms.
Right.
But I do think that there's sort of a lot to be pulling. I mean, DSA has developed, but at the same time, I think we need to sort of just be considering socialist organization and what that could look like, and just sort of based on what you two have been talking about over the past hour and a half, how we move forward, with regards to sort of these larger historical processes and traditions, and I think we need a little bit more of that kind of perspective, even though Sanders' campaign has pulled in a lot of people to sort of see things, to have a power analysis and see things in terms of class.
Right.
So that would be my response to that question.
Exactly.
But
that's a great response. I mean, I would also, just to reinforce what you're saying, I mean, winning a presidential election is not the same as taking state power, even if a socialist is president, because the state apparatus itself hasn't changed, won't change through a presidential election. But, again, so much of this conversation in this moment of crisis is all about how do you create space to keep moving forward, to build. And I think I totally agree with Michael saying about what does it mean to build civil rights unionism. Those kinds of spaces where the unions are not necessarily protecting the interests of a particular set of the working class, but trying to extend out to think about like how to promote social justice and have resources to do that, and power. But one thing, I mean, there's some things that, you want to call it positive or not positive. I think it is true that as bad as some of the Biden-Harris picks, might be for cabinet positions or whatnot, it's not as bad as, I hate to say it like this, but as some of Obama's picks, partly because, the whole movement around Bernie Sanders has pushed the debate to the left. I mean, it may not be the left compared to like the 1930s, but certainly compared to where it was. And I'm not saying that's not the same as revolution. That's not the same as taking state power. But there is a possible chimera in that, if we believe that this is the same as state power, then we end up being really disappointed when it doesn't translate into significant, substantial non-reformist reforms. That's never going to happen. It's going to happen in the streets. It's going to happen, in struggles over the terrains of power that may not necessarily be representative democracy as we know it. And that's why I'm always thinking, what's happening in places like like Jackson, Mississippi, where there's all kinds of internal struggles going on there, but still there's attempts at the local level to actually exercise power on behalf of working people dispossessed. Like, what does that mean? So I think there's a lot of work to be done, as long as we don't get trapped in thinking, revolutionary thought is liberalism. It's not the same thing. And what we're seeing is a continuation of liberalism. And the current administration is not going to, at all, in any significant way, diverge from a kind of neoliberal agenda that's been in place for a long time. Any divergence will come from pressure. And that's why the idea of, demobilizing because somehow we've got Trump out of office, as if that was really the central problem. Once he's gone, everything's gonna go back to status quo. Status quo was terrible. And status quo was exactly what we've been talking about. When Michael was talking about what happened under Clinton, that's really an important thing to remember, that these were rollbacks, these were pushbacks against any kind of working class insurgency. So now it's a time to continue that fight. So.
Okay, so I'm going to give you the hardcore response. I did not support Bernie Sanders. The last Democrat I voted for was Lyndon Johnson, who I thought was going to stop Goldwater from escalating the war in Vietnam. I was also at Atlantic City in 1964 when the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party was stabbed in the back. So Gore Vidal, the liberal economist class, said there's only one party in the United States, the party of capital, and it has two right wings. Someone sent me this, which I just got up here, from Julius Nyerere, who was the first president of Tanzania. He said the United States is a one-party state, but given US extravagance, it has two of them. So I don't believe that a capitalist party, if there was a Labor Party not supported by the capitalists or based on the capitalists, I might, under certain circumstances, support it. So I think that supporting and running within the Democratic Party, and that's not even getting into the question of what Bernie's defects were as a left-wing candidate. His inability to address issues of racial equality is fairly well known. Even in contrast to Jesse Jackson, who, when he ran, his primary campaigns was at a different strike every day. He won the Michigan primary largely on the support of white auto worker locals who liked his pro-union, pro-worker approach. So I think in that respect, while Bernie calling himself a socialist or social democrat or whatnot, has opened up some space in terms of his positions on things. Some of these people I talked to in North Carolina who are Bernie supporters try to get him or people from his campaign to support their organizing, and no one showed up. So I tend to be less enthusiastic on these particular issues, to put it mildly. And I think that so having a working class party is, well, perhaps not on the horizon, should be the goal, not thinking that you can reform the Democratic Party. So that's my position, which I came to over a period of time, but particularly the events which I talk about in the 1960s forming part of that.
Great, thank you. So actually, I'm gonna call on some folks. I see someone has a raised hand, so I'll allow you to talk and then you can ask your question live. So Diane has a hand raised and I'm gonna click on you and hopefully you're ready for us.
Hi.
Let's
I
get some
was
video.
going to, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes?
yes.
Okay, great. I'm Diane from Detroit, and I just wanted to say to Michael that not all nurses are organized. In fact, nurses in Detroit are unorganized. So when we think about the pandemic, it seems to me there's two different strategies that socialists should be thinking about. One are maybe strategic industries, like the whole transportation. But the other is those things that we found are totally inappropriate for the pandemic. So we look at nursing homes, and there you have a low wage, mostly Black or immigrant women who are forced to have two jobs. Their working conditions are horrendous. The patient conditions are horrendous. And the possibility of organizing at this particular time when there's tremendous support. I mean, something like 40% of all the people who've died are from nursing homes. So it's so obvious that we need to nationalize them or, take them over and make them places where elders would be comfortable. And here I think you have a huge community of support. So I think there's, and some of the worst rich people own these places. So I think this is just like a perfect opportunity.
100% agree with you, Diane. Let me just mention something quickly in terms of, Diane says in terms of nationalization. I'm not someone who supports Medicare for all. So I spent 4.5 years working at a VA hospital. So the VA, that's not Medicare, that's socialized medicine. Medicine run by the government, not a semi-private system like Medicare is with healthcare systems and privately paid. And I think that this should be our goal, not Medicare for all. That if we see what's happening in the UK right now, the national healthcare system is the distributor of the vaccines. They're all set up to do it. Regardless of Trump, with hundreds of healthcare providers and private insurers and everything else, this would be a nightmare no matter who was in office for getting things distributed and allocated. So I think in the end, a system like they have in the UK is superior. And I agree with everything Diane said, that nursing homes are a target of opportunity and they should be nationally run. They should not be run by all these venture capitalists and what she describes as horrible people.
Great. So yeah, we do have some time left. I'm going to call on Max, has his hand raised. Oops.
Oh, okay. Yeah, this was a pretty good discussion. I just wanted to say there was a couple of points. Well, you saw I was commenting endlessly. There's a couple of points where I like what Michael just said about not supporting Medicare for all, but instead of supporting socialized medicine. I 100% agree with that argument or that position or whatever you want to call it. And I say that as a Medicaid patient who knows, as maybe a person who knows how any benefits that we get under the reformist achievements that all this history has forced capitalists to give us. It's almost like, yeah, they gave me a sandwich, but the cheese is moldy. It's like, yeah, they gave me housing, but the housing's not that good. They gave me healthcare, the healthcare's not that good. This is why I remain a revolutionary, because reformism is, just gets you so much, and they're taking it back as they're giving it to you every time, in my personal experience and from what I've seen from the outside. And anyway, the discussion is very good. And as I mentioned, you saw me babbling. This is the problem with DSA and all reformist organizations, that I think that the labor branch is good, and it's the only place that touches on real Marxist class struggle. It would be, well, not the only, but one, to me, my experience, one of the major, one of the better parts of DSA, because, and I kind of expected that, because you can't start talking about real life labor without dealing with, class struggle issues, whereas you can talk about, other issues without, and you can kind of get away with not really dealing with the issues that are coming up today, about state power and so forth. So that all being said, my only problem is you keep saying, well, where do we go from here? Where do we go from here? Again, I'll argue the same thing forever. We have to think in terms of revolution. We have to think in terms of mass numbers, forming any kind of mass class organization, and remaining politically independent as much as we can, and driving these points home. Because for me, like Sanders, you have this mass of people joining DSA. You have this possibility of a mass movement. Mass movement is the only thing that's a real war. This is like a real thing. You're gonna maybe win something in the class war. And when you see this many people joining DSA, that's why I'm here. I want to take these people, if I can, and make them into revolutionaries, not reformists, because I want to win the class war. And if I can't do it with them, I'll go, and it's hopeless, I'll go back to my unorganized work, as I have been all my life. But we have to take advantage. You have to point out that if somebody like Sanders is tied to the Democratic Party, that is the problem. The Democratic Party is the problem. He's promising things that they can't deliver. Whether his heart's in the right place or he knows he's a sheepdog, it doesn't matter. It's doing the same thing. And what we need is something, like along the, to sum up, because I know I don't have that much time. I beg you all to study Unionism, Marxism, Trotskyism, and the history of the labor movement in the United States and the world, because that's what we need today. And those principles are key to victory.
Thank you. I definitely want to just encourage people, I know there's some anonymous questions, but also to, join the panel and join the discussion. See if anybody else pops up. I guess I have another question here that's anonymous. So what is your analysis of the strike for Black Lives and the rhetorical official union support? And where is the best point for us to intervene as rank and file workers, which I think you guys already addressed, but maybe that first point, because it is something that happened over the summer, if either one of you want to speak to that.
The strike for Black Lives, I think there's two ways to look at it. One, to look at, so what was the outcome? We always go to the outcome first. Was there a significant outcome? Perhaps not, but in terms of what it signaled, I thought it was very, very important. There's a way in which the movement for Black Lives, which I have to argue is distinct from Black Lives Matter. The movement for Black Lives is a coalition of over 70 different organizations is actually rising. And in those organizations include labor organizations. And so the strike for Black Lives was a signal of linking labor with state violence as an issue of police violence and other things. And out of that came also the sort of National Black Convention in August, Black August, which was also a way of thinking about how to strategize for the future. So, and it's true that there's some people who identify themselves as Black Lives Matter who are very much involved in the Democratic Party, like completely embroiled in it. And others who are really trying to work hard. People like Bill Fletcher and others have a long history with the labor movement trying to build this. So I think I don't want to make any kind of assessment about like whether or not the strike for Black Lives was this was an effective kind of strategy, but it did signal this relationship, which I think has to be built. When people ask about the distinction between the 26 million people who came out in protests after the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and others, that was a mass showing. And in that mass showing was certain slogans and demands that actually were about economic justice. And that's, I think, what the movement what strike for Black Lives actually meant, was kind of to signal this relationship between, abolition politics and anti-capitalist politics.
Michael, I don't know if you want to add anything to that. We only have a couple minutes left, so maybe if each of you could just give like a 1 minute, I know that's kind of tough, just sort of wrapping up final points and takeaways. Oh, Michael, if you want to go first, go ahead.
Sure. So I think that these are very disruptive, dysfunctional times. There's a lot of upsurge taking place, both among workers, the Black Lives Matter. There's also mobilization on the right. Some of it's scary. So I think these are very tumultuous times. And for me, looking at the period of particularly the 30s and 40s, the massive labor and civil rights and civil rights-oriented unionism upsurge of this period provides us some perspective, some guidance, some do's and don'ts about what we should be doing in the present period. So that's my cut. I'll put in a little plug. I mean, so I have a book about this that just came out called The Southern Key, which Robin was kind enough to write a blurb for. Without repeating what we've said, that's my overall thing on what's going on, and we'll have to see what happens. And particularly, I think more as the pandemic ends, which hopefully it will at some point, lots more possibilities for those of us who want to be out on the streets will start opening up.
Robin.
Yeah, well, it's hard to follow. I mean, my takeaway will read Michael's book, The Southern Key, definitely. It's a very important book. It also reminds us how important the South is right now, and continues to be important. I was frustrated. I remember after Trump's election, and people were sort of blaming the South, like, oh, the South, and saying that California is so progressive, and shouldn't California like succeed from the Union in the state that has one of the largest prison populations in the country, that has actually just passed legislation to undermine concierge workers as workers, that has opposed rent control. I mean, so if there's a takeaway, it is beware of liberalism, which is one of the most dangerous. Liberalism and fascism are two sides of the same coin. And we have to really be careful about moving forward into 2021 and always be grounded in a politics, I think, of class struggle that doesn't play the foolish game of, being on one side that talks about class reductionism versus race reductionism. That whole debate has actually, I think, derailed us from the social justice issues that have been foundational to a visionary politics of socialism that deals with things that range from not being locked in cages to reproductive rights. That this is the sort of politics that we need to build. And I think, just to conclude, the vision that Michael tried, laid out in terms of what does civil rights unionism look like? It's one that incorporates the whole of us, that there's no outside, that all the struggles that we bring to bear, even if it's among a few of us, are as important and central to our struggles as anything else. So, beloved community, still works for me. I'll end there.
Thank you so much for the two of you for really just providing such a fruitful discussion, and for everyone else's participation and sort of, moving forward with a lot of really big questions that we're wrestling with. The one thing I do want to do is just a couple of announcements before we go. The transit workers in New York City, so TWU, are planning a forum on December 20th, which is the anniversary of the 2015 transit strike. And I will cut and paste, let's see, a link to that. Let's see. And also right now, I think this is probably why Robert Cuffey had to hop off, is a Defund NYPD coalition meeting, which we're pulling together different organizations against police brutality, police violence, as well as obviously the labor component to try to pull together these struggles. So I'll also pop that in the chat, see if anyone's interested in hopping on after we're done. But yeah, thank you everyone for your participation and your thoughts.
Thank you.
See you in the streets. So.